Welcome to the show, Professor Wasow. We are so excited to have you here today. A little bit about you, to tell you about yourself. You've received a PhD in African American Studies, an MA in Government, and an MA in Statistics from Harvard. You have an article in the American Political Science Review called Agenda Seeding: How 1960s Black Protests Moved Elites, Public Opinion, and Voting, and potentially the most important credential of them all, you are also Angelica's professor in Poll 346. So welcome to the show, Professor Wasow. It's so great to have you.
Thank you so much for having me, Katie and Ben.
So you are well known for many things, but I think you've been quoted recently regarding this article of yours about not only protests, but also protest tactics and how they affect elections. So not to be that person, but if you could present a soundbite of your own findings, could you do so and explain quickly so that then every other question we ask you makes sense?
Sure, of course. So if I were at a dinner party trying to explain my research, I would say something like, I'm particularly interested in how groups that are at the margins of society can advance their interests. And one of the most common ways groups, whether it's people with AIDS or people with disabilities, or in the 1960s, African Americans, try to advance their cause is through protests. And so then within that, what kinds of tactics do we see are most effective? And what I found in the 1960s is that a key way in which protests influence politics is through the media, right? So it's not just that a protest happens, but that it gets amplified by media coverage. And the media really care about they're attracted to violence. So where, there's a classic saying in local news: if it bleeds, it leads. Is that when protesters engaged in nonviolent protests, that could generate some media, but what really generated a lot of media was when nonviolent protests were met with really brutal state repression. So a classic example of that is Bloody Sunday, John Lewis walking across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, being beaten. Those images were broadcast around the world. The flip side is when protesters engaged in more violent resistance to white supremacy, what that often generated were stories about things like crime and riots, and produced much less sympathetic media to the cause of civil rights.
But what happens in situations when there is some contesting about who was violent or who started the violence?
It's a really important question. And I think, let me begin by saying defining violence is not obvious, right? So, if an event is 1,000 people and 5 of them light a car on fire, right? That is an event that is 99% nonviolent, right? In terms of the participants. But oftentimes the media will focus on the car that's on fire because that's visually compelling and kind of dramatic. There's a tradition, particularly in sociology, of saying events have about 30 people, that there's some significant damage to property or injury to people or potentially death, and that those are the ways in which we're going to kind of define a certain an event as having some kind of protester-initiated violence or police-initiated violence. If there is a sense that protesters participated in violence, then the story becomes one of disorder and crime and riot. So in some ways, your most powerful move, at least in the 1960s, in terms of trying to produce a certain kind of story in the media, was to let the state engage in aggression and to basically make yourself a target and have that be the image in the national media. Now, in short, to kind of represent good guys and bad guys, bullies and victims.
So also on this kind of question of, who is perpetrating violence and how is it perceived? One of kind of the biggest events, I think, of protests this year has been the Capitol riots, which were really disturbing to see. And so we were curious to get your reflection on seeing those images of violence in the media, and also subsequent,
So one, I think, let's come at the question of the January 6th insurrection from kind of two perspectives. So one thing we observed in the 1960s is that there is a fragmented media then too. And what we see in the current moment is also the absence of a shared reality. So the first thing I would say is media are fragmented historically, fragmented now, and these are highly contentious politics, produce a kind of contentious set of projects to define the narrative. But I think the larger story is that the kind of sort of norm violation that is a set of civilians engaging in violence against the state is sufficiently shocking that on the whole, what we've seen is an attempt to sort of, even by people on the right, to distance themselves from that action.
And you've been talking about the power of the headline that comes out in terms of the effect that it has on the American population or the people that weren't there. And I wonder about how the concept and the kind of catchphrase of if and how the term fake news has affected people's reaction to things. A commander in chief saying, oh, that's fake news, thrown this idea of what's reported into media up in the air.
In some ways, the way I kind of think about this is that our understanding of the world is essentially, kind of mediated through stories. We make sense of the world in stories, and that a lot of those stories come to us from the media. The other important detail is we often are wanting stories that affirm our sense of being heroes and being right and being on the side of what is good and righteous. And so what that means is that if the world is changing in ways that are hard to make sense of, and somebody comes along and says, well, those people are lying, then it can be very satisfying to kind of tune out of what might be a more mainstream set of media and tune into media that kind of give you an affirming view, whether that's on the left or the right. And that's a real challenge for a big, diverse democracy, because of course, if we don't have a shared reality, it can be hard to for the center to hold. And I don't mean political center, I mean literally like the institutions.
So thank you for giving us kind of this context around protests and these really serious and important questions. I wanted to take us in a little bit of a different direction, if that's okay, because we were reading that, in a past life, before you're a professor at Princeton, you were the founder of a social media site, Black Planet. You were the first recipient of an iPad, which is an incredible, I imagine, for, fun fact. And also you were on Oprah, it looks like several times.
Many times.
Just awesome. So kind of two questions. I was curious if you could talk about, your experience in the technology world before this. And then also what, if I understand correctly, you got your PhD after this. So what led to that change and kind of like to where you are today, which is somewhat different, but it seems interesting to me.
Yeah. So, I think I've always been driven by questions. And when I came out of college, I went to Stanford at a time when, early online media were just starting to percolate. And I was really interested in could you build a successful multicultural online community? Trying to bring some of the sort of marry two worlds. Like I was a techie and a nerd, but also somebody who, really wanted to diversify what seemed like a fairly homogenous online universe. And so kind of just trying to always be an entrepreneur and bring these different parts of myself together. And then over time, there were other questions that were always in my mind, but just sort of became ascendant. And by about mid 2000s, I really wanted to address some other questions, in particular around trying to understand the rise of mass incarceration. And so went from being a technology entrepreneur and a tech reporter on TV to going back to grad school with an interest in really trying to understand this period in American history where incarceration rates just start to skyrocket.
What surprised you about June 2020 and those protests with all of the context and background that you already had?
So a couple of things that were surprising for me. I think one is based on my reading of the 1960s and the ways in which violence could backfire on a cause. I think one lesson is that there may be a small amount of violence that might actually help a cause. And by that, I mean, it might be that in order to get media attention, having that, to use the example that I used before, a burning car might be the kind of thing that sort of helps to focus attention. A couple of other things that surprised me in the 1960s, the media play a really critical role, but the larger white public is again kind of largely indifferent to the cause of civil rights and really has to be pulled by Black activists. And here, what we saw in the kind of larger Black Lives Matter protests, where many of the events were majority white, and you saw a kind of really active, younger generation going out and participating in these protests feeling like it was important to them too.
And is there one thing that you wish all Princeton students knew that like you can't graduate without knowing or thinking about?
The thing that I really try to impart to my students is a lesson about, it builds on work by a scholar named Carol Dweck, who, the kind of bumper sticker version of her research is that it's effort makes ability is the bumper sticker. And nobody gets to Princeton without being told a lot of times they're smart. And that's a very double-edged sword because we don't know how to turn on and off smart. So it's sort of this thing, you feel like you have it or you don't. And when you have a thing you don't have a lot of control over, what research shows is people get very invested in performing that they are smart, but not subjecting themselves to stressful situations where they might, learn that they're not as smart as they think they are. And so you want to avoid, in some cases, being tested because you wouldn't want to get a negative signal back. And what Carol Dweck's research shows is that you should really think of smarts as like a muscle, right? That intelligence is much more a function of kind of sustained time on task and learning than it is about your innate genius. And that, focusing on your innate talents and gifts, which, again, clearly we all have different interests, we all have different passions. I'm not saying there isn't idiosyncrasies among each of us as people, whether as faculty or students, but fundamentally, what's going to allow you to live a much more kind of fulfilled and rich life is not focusing on things you think of as like the innate talents you have, but rather the hard work you can put into becoming a better version of yourself.
Thank you so much. This has been a really educational and exciting hour. And thank you for carving out an hour of your schedule.
Thank you for the opportunity. Grateful for the chance.